Robert Piggott there, who was talking to me earlier from Glasgow. As you heard, only hours after the Scottish referendum results, the Parliament in the Spanish region of Catalonia approved a law to have a non-binding consultation on independence from Spain. Catalonia is just one of a number of regions right around the world where people were following the vote in Scotland closely. One of the key parties in the province of Quebec in Canada, for example, and the region of Flanders in Belgium are all now calling for independence. Let's discuss this with David Rezvani, who's the visiting research assistant professor and lecturer at Dartmouth College. He's also the author of the book Surpassing the Sovereign State, the Wealth, Self-Rule and Security of Partially Independent Territories. What are your initial thoughts, Professor, about the results of the Scottish referendum?
Well, I think it's great news for Scotland. The current status of partial independence is far better of what they would have otherwise achieved with full independence.
In which way?
Well, most sovereign states in the world are weak, they're poor, they're insecure, because they have to fend for themselves. It's not an accident that according to the Fund for Peace, around 80% of sovereign states in the world suffer from some form of insecurity and lack of stability.
Arguably, though, there are states in the world that can stand on their own feet, and that was always the argument from the Scottish nationalists, that they perhaps would be better off. Was that a false argument then?
Well, you know, a lot of the states that they point out are exceptions to the rule, like Iceland. But even in the case of Iceland in 2008 faced disaster and economic depression during the financial crisis when, as a fully independent state, there was no one to bail them out. But by contrast, the Bank of England spent almost £150 billion to prevent failure of the Bank of Scotland and the Royal Bank of Scotland. Plus, another thing to keep in mind is that, you know, the S&P compares Scotland to Iceland, but what they should really be doing is compare Scotland to other partially independent territories like Bermuda. Bermuda has a GDP per capita of over $100,000 per year. So that's a better example for them. That's what they could achieve, potentially.
What is it intrinsically about those smaller states that does seem to condemn them from your argument to failure?
Well, you know, sovereign states are on their own. They don't have a lot of the advantages that Scotland has. Scotland has guaranteed powers. It has fiscal transfers. It has economic union. It has proxy diplomatic representation. It has strengthened defense. It has institutions for dispute resolution. It has shared reputational advantages with the United Kingdom. It has an economic safety net. A fully independent state, especially a small fully independent state like Scotland would have been, wouldn't have those things. They're on their own.
So they're able to
another thing to keep in mind is this. If America was associated with a sovereign state that was 15 times the size of the United States, which is the sort of the differential between the UK is 15 times the size of Scotland. If America was associated with such a state, and that state was providing all sorts of advantages to America to help with its defense, to give it all sorts of public goods, Americans would be a fool to walk away from such a deal. So I'm not surprised that the Scots would vote against independence.
And a vote against independence is to have your cake and eat it, then?
That's right. It's not just a vote against independence. It's a vote in favor of their currently partially independent status.
The Prime Minister, David Cameron, has said that three main Westminster parties would now deliver their campaign pledge to boost the powers of Scotland's devolved parliament. What kind of powers could Scotland push for now?
Well, of course, this fiscal autonomy has been in the offing, where they would have extra taxation powers, etc. But one of the things that I would like to raise is the fact that future nationalist calls for independence, they'll be further undermined by allowing Scotland some diplomatic powers. In fact, a common feature of partially independent territories throughout the world is that they have limited diplomatic powers. So, for example, Hong Kong is a member of numerous international organizations like the World Trade Organization and the International Monetary Fund. Partially independent territories like Guernsey and Jersey have limited treaty negotiating capabilities. Are Scottish leaders, are British leaders, actually British leaders probably are Scottish leaders aware that British territories like Bermuda and the Cayman Islands are each members of nearly 10 different international organizations? So you have other partially independent territories that are in the neighborhood of Scotland, like the Åland Islands, vis-a-vis Finland or Greenland or the Faroe Islands. Each of those are members of the Nordic Council side by side with countries like Norway and Iceland. Scotland could also join.
Despite all these apparent inducements, Professor, you will know that the impact of the Scottish referendum was being felt in places like Catalonia and in Quebec and in Flanders, regions that want independence. How do you think the no vote will affect the independence campaign in those countries?
Well, you know, in most cases, partial independence, in my view, is far more advantageous than full independence because the settlement that oftentimes they're offered in the case of partial independence. But one of the exceptions, I think, is the case of Catalonia. Sadly, I think the first thing to keep in mind is that Spain's economy is just 5 times larger than Catalonia, which means that the core state, Spain, is poorly positioned to provide Catalonia with public goods that might convince it to maintain its union.
Yeah, they speak different language as well in Catalonia and in Quebec and arguably in Flanders as well. Does that make a difference, do you think, the cultural aspect of all of this?
I think the cultural aspect is potentially huge. It doesn't necessarily have to be. In the case of the recent Scottish referendum, the British leaders were very careful to bow to Scottish cultural distinctiveness and acknowledge Scotland's national heritage as Scots, but I don't see that happening as much between the leadership of Spain and Catalonia. I think Spain would be it really needs to do more to love bomb Catalonia and do more to recognize Catalonia's distinctiveness. But
the people in some of these smaller states, or if you like, regions of the world that have been engaged in the independence debate from their own perspectives will be considering that the Scottish no vote was pragmatic, amongst other things. I wonder whether that will affect the way they then push for independence or to stay as part of the union.
Yeah, well, with respect to the pragmatic aspects of the relationship between Spain and Catalonia, one thing to keep in mind is that Scotland has fiscal autonomy, or it will have fiscal autonomy if the leaders of Britain implement what they've said. The Basque Country already has it in Spain, but not Catalonia. And as a result, the core state, Spain, takes approximately 8% more revenue from the territory of Catalonia than it returns in the form of services. So, you know, that is certainly does not bode well for the togetherness of Spain and Catalonia.
Are you using those terms of partial independence and autonomy interchangeably, or is there a difference?
Yeah, there is a difference. In the case of partially independent territories, there are nearly 50 in the world. They include places like Hong Kong, Scotland, Greenland, Cayman Islands, Iraqi Kurdistan, Puerto Rico, New Caledonia. These are nationalistically distinct territories that divide and share some, what you could call sovereign powers or powers of independence with a sovereign core state. So these are not member units of federations. And they're not what you could call sham autonomous regions. So you have certain sham autonomous regions like the autonomous region of Tibet in China or the Bantustans of South Africa during the apartheid regime. Instead, these partially independent territories, these are areas that have credible forms of final decision-making powers that are allocated to them, much like what Scotland has.
What about the Quebec situation? How different is that from the other regions we've been talking about?
Well, in the case of Quebec, much of the reason, and this particular fact doesn't seem to have been broadcast that much. Much of the reason for Quebec's independent movement in the first place is that they were not given the kind of home rule that Scotland has now. So, in other words, their first choice was a status similar to Scotland's current condition. When that was not given to them after the failure of the 1986 Meech Lake and the 1992 Charlottetown Accords, then you had a powerful resurgence of the secessionist Parti Québécois. The Parti Québécois is Quebec's version of the SNP. And shortly after the failure of the 1992 Charlottetown Accords, when they would have been given a special status, a special society status, similar to what Scotland has now, after that, the failure of that in Canada, the Parti Québécois won a majority in Quebec's provincial parliament, and they pushed for independence in their 1995 referendum. So that's one thing to keep in mind with respect to Quebec as compared to Scotland.
Professor, I'm very grateful to you. Thanks for explaining quite a lot there. Thank you.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Professor, David Rezvani there, who's a visiting research assistant professor and lecturer at Dartmouth College. After the news and sport, we'll get the week's news from Kenya. But first, let's get the headlines with Mike Young.